Hello, audience, wherever you may hail. I'm your host, John Bruni. Welcome to The Focus. Join us as we explore some of the world's most fascinating and essential contemporary developments, shedding a spot of light in a world filled with alternative fact darkness. In this podcast from Harvard University, Cambridge, Massachusetts, we are happy to be joined by one of the giants of the Realist School of International Relations, Professor Stephen M. Walt, talking about China-US relations. Stephen, welcome to The Focus.
Really nice to be talking with you today.
Stephen, how has China's rise in the Indo-Pacific contributed to America's contemporary foreign policy priorities and dilemmas?
I think the most obviously it's shifted a lot of American attention to the balance of power in Asia and a much greater focus on the potential long-term challenge that a more powerful China creates. I think, 25 years ago, there was a hope, at least among some in the United States, that China would rise and become, to use a famous phrase, a responsible stakeholder, and that basically would gradually liberalize, become democratic, and we'd have a sort of nice, relatively benign international order with the United States still probably pretty much in charge, but with China as very much a partner. And I think those hopes have not been borne out. I think those were always a little bit optimistic. So what you're seeing, and it really didn't happen recently, beginning actually way back with the Bush administration, but then a little bit more with Obama, a little bit more with Trump, and now with Biden, growing American attention to what China's rise means and what needs to be done to protect both American interests, but also the interests of other countries in Asia in the face of a more capable, powerful, and ambitious China.
So how has the Russian war in Ukraine affected America's position regarding China? I mean, the more American weapons go to Ukraine, the less there'll be for any China contingency in the near term, right?
Well, yes and no. I mean, most of the things that are going to Ukraine are not particularly relevant for a conflict with China. The artillery systems, for example, are not particularly useful in a naval battle. So in that sense, it doesn't really affect the balance of power very much. I think the biggest effects are sort of twofold. One is it is an enormous distraction. It has focused an enormous amount of American attention, lots of time, energy, bandwidth being taken up addressing not just the immediate situation in Ukraine, but also then the repercussions elsewhere in Europe, the repercussions for countries around the world. So that's one problem. And second, it has, I think, reinforced in some respects the tacit alignment between Moscow and Beijing. That was already there. It didn't create it, but it has reinforced it in certain respects. And over time, it's likely to have, some longer term consequences in terms of, putting China in a position where it doesn't really have to worry about Russia very much. I think there's some other reasons for that as well, but I think those are the two most immediate effects that the war in Ukraine has had.
Stephen, the Obama administration started the whole pivot to Asia thing off, right? So at least from a sort of open source public policy perspective, but it was destabilized by events in the Middle East that dragged America back from the pivot. Can you see a similar sort of role that the Ukraine war will have on United States foreign policy? As you rightly point out, there's this distraction in Europe. There are big fish that could go under as a consequence of European chaos, and America may feel that it needs to reset its priorities back to Europe, which could affect its position in Asia.
Yeah, I think that's a potential danger, but I don't think it's by any means inevitable. And it seems to me, is an opportunity for the United States and, for that matter, its European partners and its Asian allies to work out a sort of new and updated division of labor. I mean, one of the interesting things we're learning about Russia in the context of the conflict is that Russia is actually not nearly as powerful as some people thought. There was this argument a few years ago that, that there had been military reforms in Russia, that they were no longer flat on their back. They really had capabilities, and therefore they really posed a considerable threat to Europe, and one that Europe really could never handle on its own. So the United States had to be there, had to be the first responder, even in Europe. And I think what we're seeing is, of course, Russia's not nearly as capable as people thought. They are having enough trouble dealing with Ukraine. The idea that they could take on the rest of NATO at this point is, I think, really kind of laughable. Moreover, Russia's going to get weaker over time, not stronger. The economic sanctions will have a long-term effect on Russia's military potential. It's got wicked demographic problems that are going to be a problem for them going forward. What this really means is that America's European allies are probably capable, certainly have the latent power potential to deal with Russia without much help from the United States. It's worth remembering that NATO's European members, not counting America, just the European members, outspend Russia on defense by about 4 times every year. Right? Russia's economy is smaller than Italy's alone. Right? So Europe is infinitely capable of defending itself, maybe with a little bit of help from the United States if it gets its act together. Now, it won't do that as long as it can always count on Uncle Sam to ride to the rescue. But it seems to me this is, in fact, an opportunity over the next few years for America and its European allies to talk about a more sensible division of labor, where they do more to defend themselves. And that allows the United States to shift more attention and resources to Asia, which is where the major challenge is likely to be in the years ahead.
Speaking about this shift to Asia, there's always been this sort of long-held concern that America's military firepower is probably not enough, even against the one large antagonist in Asia. In decades gone past, we had a situation where the United States could fight 2 wars globally, or at least 2.5 wars, even if we were a bit more optimistic. Does the new repositioning against China mean that America is a more reduced presence internationally, and therefore this plays into Chinese policymakers' ideas that it's okay to provoke US allies in the Indo-Pacific whenever it wants? I mean, is there some sort of power disparity that Beijing is counting on as the US repositions, and there's not that kind of overarching weight, shall we say?
Yeah, it sort of depends on what your baseline here is. I mean, if your baseline is, say, 1965, when China was very weak, or even your baseline is the early 1990s, when China was starting to rise economically. It hadn't converted much of that economic potential into military capabilities. The United States is really on top of the world. The Soviet Union has disappeared. If that's your baseline, the United States was really in great shape. But I think it's a mistake to say that even though the balance of power has shifted somewhat because China has risen, that the United States is incapable of defending its interests in Asia, or that Asian countries are suddenly newly vulnerable. The same forces that make it somewhat more difficult for the United States to, say, project power right up to China's borders also make it difficult for China to project power anywhere else. It's hard to threaten other countries across bodies of water. Amphibious operations are notoriously the most difficult kind of military action to undertake. So, there's no question that China is more capable, but its ability to, call up a country in Asia and threaten it with military force is still, I think, relatively limited. Not to mention all of the political consequences that would befall any serious effort to use force to change the status quo in Asia. So again, it's just something to obviously pay attention to and to be concerned about, but it is, I think, a long way from game over in the Pacific.
Interestingly enough,
one other point there.
Oh, sorry.
Just one other point that occurs to me is that it's worth remembering, China does not have a free hand in Asia. There are a number of powerful, capable countries there as well. It's not like China is facing a series of very weak and vulnerable states. India is eventually going to have a larger population, is developing economically. Japan has the fifth most powerful military on the planet, a quite serious economy as well. South Korea is militarily capable. Australia is, for its size, I think, a quite militarily sophisticated country as well. These are all countries that would not be easy for China, it seems to me, to intimidate, even given China's considerable size. So I think if you look again at the trend lines, they are something to pay attention to, but it's not something to panic over or assume that the various countries that are concerned about China's rise, not something they can't deal with.
Actually, it's interesting you should say that. So what we'll do is we'll invert the line of questioning, because initially I wanted to get your take on US power in Asia, but Chinese power in Asia seems to be hamstrung by one very obvious point, and that is that it has no allies. Where are the network of allies that the Chinese can depend on to either lend proxy support or do anything for encouraging a much broader Chinese strategic footprint? It's kind of interesting that they've been working on this Belt and Road Initiative. They've also been working on trying to, expand their extractive resource industry into Africa. But if anything were to threaten either the Belt and Road infrastructure or Chinese mining interests in deepest, darkest Africa, where do the Chinese go? It doesn't seem like they have power projection, certainly not in a similar way that the United States does. And from your reading of the situation, are they on the cusp of developing something like this? Or is this, as you rightly point out, a far distant ambition for the Chinese to go down?
There's a lot to be said on this. So let me say a couple of things. I mean, I think the Belt and Road Initiative, I think, has always been somewhat exaggerated as a strategic game changer. There's certainly some ways in which they have been able to get, I think, some additional attention or interest from countries. But I think as the Belt and Road Initiative has proceeded, its limitations and its downsides have become more apparent to others, that many of the projects haven't gone particularly well. A lot of the countries that basically took money from China in order to do these things now can't pay them back, which is both a problem for them, but of course it's also a problem for China. That would obviously like the money back, and they're having to extend loans and renegotiate terms and things like that. The conduct of the Chinese personnel that have done some of these projects hasn't always won them a lot of friends as well. It's not a case of Chinese money coming in and putting lots of people to work in a country. It's Chinese money coming in and putting a lot of Chinese workers to work in that country building the project. And lastly, there is this question of whether building infrastructure in another country really gets you a lot of influence. Once you've built a railroad or a bridge or an aqueduct or a highway, you can't just pick it up and take it home if you don't like what the government in that country is doing. Yeah. So in a sense, it might be a way of expanding infrastructure in Asia and encouraging economic development. But the idea that this was going to be some, wonderful game-changing initiative that we would look back on in 50 years and say, that's when China really took over, I think that was always exaggerated. That's point number one. But big point number two is, I think the principal source of Chinese influence, and people in Australia know this well, is the sheer size of the Chinese economy. Right, the fact that many countries in Asia have close economic ties with China because they want to sell to the Chinese market, whether it's more advanced manufactured products or it's raw materials or whatever. That immediately gives China some influence. Countries like Japan, countries like South Korea, countries like Australia will at least ask themselves the question, what's going to happen if we do the following step and it makes Beijing angry? So in that sense, you do get some degree of influence. And I think it's the one area where the United States has not countered China as effectively as we could have. Trump's decision, for example, to walk away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership seems to me was very short-sighted. for that reason. Third and last point, what to me is even more striking in all of this is how I think China has squandered the opportunity to build more reliable ties with its neighbors and indeed with others around the world. At roughly the same time that China's economy was really becoming world class and it was starting to extend trade relations elsewhere in a big way, they also began adopting a very heavy-handed, almost belligerent approach to diplomacy, hypersensitive, easily offended, insulting other people. Sometimes this gets labeled, so-called wolf warrior diplomacy. And the reactions everywhere, especially in Australia, have been almost completely negative. So that China's overall image in the world has declined dramatically over the last few years. And countries that were actually working pretty hard to try and maintain a good relationship with China have distanced themselves in a variety of ways, even at some economic cost to themselves. And that to me is one of these, from Beijing's perspective, an extraordinary own goal. That is a little bit hard to understand, a little bit hard to explain, and why they didn't correct it more quickly when the effects became clear is a bit of a mystery to me.
Do you think that may be because of the Chinese political culture? I mean, there's been a lot of talk these days on the social media with regard to, idealism, democracy, autocracy. What does it all mean? How does it all sort of fit into a thing that we can all understand? Could you say from a more anthropological perspective that states that have totalitarian autocratic systems really can't help themselves? They're always going to gravitate toward reaching for the stick as opposed to the olive branch. They're always going to be more force as opposed to soft power. And maybe, China's experimentation with soft power, maybe internally it didn't seem to be getting the kind of traction that it should have. And so they then reverted to more hard power, or at least, they calculated that hard power objectives would be a way in which they can intimidate their way to get what they want.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea. I'm sort of inclined to be skeptical only. I mean, there may be something to this, and certainly there are aspects of, I think, Chinese political culture, and in particular, the sort of modern forms that Chinese nationalism takes. Yeah. Their sense of sort of the last 2 centuries of sort of century of humiliation, China being taken advantage of when it was weak, all true, by the way, that has led to a certain, I don't want to say bellicose, but a sort of now that we're strong, we don't have to compromise, we don't have to be subtle. We don't have to, sort of work out amicable arrangements with others. And we're going to be extremely sensitive to anyone who criticizes us. That may be true, but the place I would, I guess, part company is to suggest that, of course, democracies are capable of similar behavior. The United States has not exactly, pinned the meter in terms of relying on smooth diplomacy, especially over the last 20 or 25 years or so. We have a certain tendency to try and tell the world what to do, and if they don't like it, we impose sanctions, and if they still keep doing it, then we think about doing some other things as well. I like to think that we're smoother than that, and that we have more soft power. But let's just say we've squandered a lot of the soft power we've had, and it would be nice if we could start rebuilding that.
Yeah, for sure. China has seen a steady progression of American strategic diplomacy in the Indo-Pacific over the past few years. I mean, we had the revival of the quadrilateral dialogue, also known as the Quad, at the behest of late former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, which brought together the United States, Japan, India, and Australia to a regular leaders summit. Then last year, we had the surprise announcement of AUKUS between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Using the Realist's take on how the Chinese might view these Western strategic contrivances, could we say that just as Russia feared NATO expansion into Eastern Europe, US-led efforts at blocking Chinese strategic power in the Indo-Pacific could lead us down a similar path to what we witnessed from 2008 onwards in Eastern Europe?
Yeah, I think there's no question that China regards American efforts to bolster its various alliance networks in Asia as a serious challenge. And this is really a sort of classic example of a main central international relations concept, this idea of a security dilemma. That basically the things I do to make myself more secure tend to make you less secure. Not because I necessarily want to make you less secure, but just because that's the inevitable consequence. So we see the things China is doing, building up its military power, building up islands in the South China Sea, making territorial claims that no one else accepts, threatening to take action against Taiwan, et cetera, et cetera. We see all of those things as potentially dangerous. And so the United States, India, Australia, South Korea, Japan, and a few other countries all start talking to each other, getting together and starting to figure out how they're going to deal with this problem. Over in Beijing, of course, that looks like encirclement. That looks like an effort to deny China its rightful place in the world, et cetera, et cetera. And it's not that either side is necessarily wrong, right? That China has a reason to worry about America's alliances getting stronger, more capable, and tighter, just as we have reasons to worry about some of the things China has been doing as well. And the real challenge for diplomats and leaders in both Beijing and Washington and in other capitals in Asia is going to be to manage that set of mutual security concerns in a way that doesn't lead to some kind of an explosion. Now, what worries me the most, and here's where the analogy with Eastern Europe might be relevant, is I think part of what was happening in Ukraine was a Russian perception that Ukraine was being drawn rapidly and inevitably into the Western orbit. Whether it was going to join NATO or not, a separate issue, but we were beginning to arm them. We were training the Ukrainian military. Ukraine was going to get more militarily capable over time and much harder to shove around, which meant Russia had a window that was closing. If they were ever going to do anything about Ukraine, they had to do it relatively soon. They had to either get the West to back off or they had to do what they ultimately did. Now, if you think about the situation in Asia, you do worry a little bit about things like the Taiwan issue. If the United States and Taiwan begin taking steps to make it easier for Taiwan to defend itself against a military attack, is there a point at which China looks at that process and says, we're running out of time. If we wait another couple of years, it's going to be too hard to do. So we better do something now. I am not saying that is going to happen, but that's the kind of dynamic that I would worry a little bit about.
Stephen, reflecting on what we've said up to now with regard to China-US relations, do you think that we're standing on the precipice of Thucydides' trap?
Well, Thucydides' trap was a phrase coined by my colleague Graham Allison, and I actually don't think it's a particularly useful way of thinking about this. The fact that the two most powerful countries in the world are eyeing each other warily is not surprising. That's sort of classic, realpolitik or classic realism 101. That does not by any means mean that a war is inevitable. One of the interesting features of these two countries, of course, is neither one really can pose an existential threat to the other. I mean, apart from the existence of nuclear weapons. The United States does not have the capability to sail across the Pacific Ocean, land troops in China, march to Beijing, depose its government, and say, now we want you to be a multi-party democracy. China does not and never will have the capability to sail the other way across the Pacific, land in San Francisco, and drive across to Washington to turn us into a one-party autocracy. So in that sense, we don't face an existential danger there. What we do face is a competition for status, for power, for influence, in some cases, probably for market share, for influence over a variety of features of international politics, like the nature of digital infrastructure, which is not a trivial issue. But if you can't knock your rival out, then mutual coexistence is the only alternative you've got left, and you simply have to figure out a way to do that still allows China to run itself the way it wants to do it, and allows the United States and its allies to govern their own affairs they want to. So I worry that the Thucydides trap suggests an area or a realm of inevitability that I think is not called for here.
Okay, so this is a tricky one. How could we have better handled our expectations regarding China? I mean, we all believe that by educating the Chinese elites in our way of thinking, especially in economics, we might end up transforming the Chinese Communist Party into a more benign institution. How did this thinking go so very wrong for us?
Excuse me 1 second.
Yep.
I think that, first of all, it was the sort of overconfidence or call it liberal hubris. At the end of the Cold War, with the triumph over the Soviet Union, there was this pretty widespread belief that the United States and its democratic allies had found the magic formula for success in the world. And you kind of had to be like us in order to succeed in a globalized world. You see this in the writings of Tom Friedman and a number of other people back in the 1990s. And there was some social science that purported to back that up as well. And I think, that we just failed to consider the possibility that a country could be a pretty successful capitalist economy and still be a one-party state. We just missed that possibility. I think, secondly, there was a little bit of hubris in our ability to do kind of social engineering. That, we would teach the Chinese how to run a country and how to set up a political system, and it would be obvious that they should become more like us. And that, again, exaggerated our ability to influence ancient, well-established culture and a very powerful set of political institutions within China itself. And then last but not least, we did not conduct ourselves very intelligently. If you sort of look at what's happened to American politics over the last 25 years, we don't seem like quite the role model we might have appeared to be in 1993, 1994. And I would add, we also, depending on your estimates, squandered $4 to $7 trillion in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, which is money that could have been spent either starting to balance China more effectively in Asia, or spent here in the United States on infrastructure and education and healthcare and a variety of other good things. Or we could have just left that money in the taxpayers' pockets, kept the American deficit a little lower than it was, et cetera. There's lots of things we could have done with that. So it's a combination of overconfidence on a number of different fronts that I think meant that we didn't handle the Chinese rise particularly well.
Stephen, for many outsiders, the Trump-Biden period has certainly been one of extremes in how the US has managed its international relations. Trump saw things from his America First position and diminished the importance of traditional allies whom he considered freeloaders and traditional friendship networks, which he largely devalued. He also saw the benefit of making friends with the likes of Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping, and Kim Jong-un in a very unorthodox form of American presidential diplomacy. Then, with the election of Biden, we saw Washington return to a more normal and predictable pattern of diplomacy. Has this period weakened rather than strengthened America? And how do you think the Chinese view American foreign and strategic policy today?
I do not, to be candid, I don't have a clear sense of how China views things right at the moment. It always in flux. I think there's no question the last 7 years or so has weakened America's international position. And the most fundamental way is really neither Trump's fault nor Biden's fault. It's both their faults. It's a consequence of the polarization of the American political system, where you can have policies on some key issues swing 180 degrees with the outcome of a presidential election. The most obvious example of this would be, say, the nuclear deal with Iran. Signed by the Biden or by the Obama administration, torn up by President Trump, something opposed by all of our allies, except a few in the Middle East. And And now Biden comes back in and says he wants to get back into it, but of course hasn't been able to do so as well for various reasons. The problem here is that other countries are going to be less willing to adjust their behavior in exchange for American promises if they think an American promise only lasts as long as the next election and might get reversed by a successor. With a polarized Senate, it's very hard to ratify treaties now, so formal agreements can't be made. You have to do these things with executive orders by a president, and what one president signs, another president can erase. Yeah. And that's, I think, a real problem long-term for our credibility. I think Trump, in the case of Trump had a number of reasonably good instincts about some aspects of international affairs. He was correct to be concerned about China. He was correct to accuse some of our allies of not pulling their weight. That, by the way, was not unique to Donald Trump. That's a complaint that's been made by every American president going back to Eisenhower. Yeah. So there's nothing particularly original about that. His problem was he had no strategy. He had no actual plan for translating those instincts into an effective set of policies that would actually get other countries to do what we wanted. And that was most obvious in the case of North Korea. He somehow thought he could go personally charm or hoodwink Kim Jong-un. And if that was never going to work, people pointed this out from the very beginning, that he was never going to get the grand bargain that he hoped for. And that turned out to be true. Kim Jong-un got the status of getting a personal meeting with the American president, something no other North Korean leader had ever gotten, and the United States got exactly nothing. So this was, for the master deal maker, this was not a particularly good performance here. I think Biden's problem, of course, is that he's been unable to go beyond sort of atmospherics. His style is radically different. He has repaired a lot of those political ties. He clearly is strongly committed to America's existing alliances, but for a variety of different reasons, he hasn't been able to, I think, implement the kind of policy shifts that he wanted, whether it's on climate, whether it's on really making the pivot to Asia work, et cetera, really getting a somewhat different set of relationships in the Middle East. He hasn't gotten us back into the Iran nuclear deal, et cetera. And in many ways, the substance of what Biden has done is not that different from Trump. The style is very different, but the substance is not that much of a radical shift.
I'm John Bruni, and you're listening to Sage International's The Focus podcast, and we're speaking with Harvard University's Professor Stephen M. Walt on China-US relations. Stephen, we in Australia are having very big discussions about how to manage China. Our last Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, took a very hardline view against China. New Prime Minister Anthony Albanese seems to be more nuanced, keeping open the possibility for diplomacy. How much does Washington value its alliance with Australia? And how much trust is there for Australia to develop niche solutions, especially when it comes to Chinese incursions into the South Pacific, like the Solomon Islands?
I think the relationship between the United States and Australia is particularly close. This has, pretty deep historical roots. It probably has some, cultural connections. Australians and Americans get along pretty readily, I think, for a variety of reasons. And there's obviously the sort of intense intelligence cooperation through the Five Eyes program, which is, quite an unusual degree of intimacy in sharing information as well. So, and the last is often pointed out, Australia has been a country that I think has fought with the United States in almost every war we've been in the last 100 years or so. So, that's kind of a remarkable record as well. So in that sense, I think there's quite a close relationship. I do think that if you think about America's alliances in Asia more broadly, managing that set of relations is a real challenge, and it's a much bigger challenge than, say, managing NATO. And let me explain why I say that. I mean, first of all, the distances in Asia are enormous. Europe is relatively small by comparison, but the distance from, New Delhi to Canberra, from Canberra to Tokyo, from Tokyo, elsewhere. These are vast distances as well. And what that means is if trouble happens somewhere, say over Taiwan, it's easy for some of these countries to say, well, that's not really our problem, or there's not really very much we can do about it. So distance doesn't contribute to cohesion in the same way that being close together contributed to cohesion in NATO. You know, if you attacked Germany, France had to worry about it, etc. Yeah. That's one issue. Second issue, of course, is that, as I mentioned a while back, most countries in Asia have tight economic relations with China that they would like to preserve if at all possible. So there is some tension between their desire for a security partnership with the United States and in some cases with each other. You mentioned the Quad, but their desire to not sever the economic relationship they enjoy with China. And then the third problem is that some of these countries don't like each other very much, most obviously in the case of South Korea and Japan. That's, again, something that the United States can manage. What all this means is that there's a real role for an alliance leader here to sort of smooth those tensions, to manage the relationships, to make sure everybody's pulling their weight, etc. And that requires the United States to be pretty actively engaged in the region. And unfortunately, you know, we're coming off a period where, you know, for 30 or 40 years, it was NATO that was the centerpiece of a lot of American strategic thinking and attention. Then there was the war on terror. So it's the Middle East, it's Afghanistan, it's Iraq, it's radicalism. What we need now is to have a focus that's much more dedicated to Asia, with, you know, your very best people assigned to it, with a cadre of experts that get trained and deployed, where presidents understand that they're going to be going to Asia as often as they might have previously gone to Europe, etc. And when they're not there, they're sending other top people, so that there's lots of care and feeding and lots of diplomatic gardening going on inside the region. I think all of that, those things are possible, but that's the kind of attention it's going to need, because managing this set of alliances is as much a diplomatic problem as it is sort of military technology. You know, do we have enough ships, planes, troops, etc. in the region?
Well, speaking about diplomatic problems, let's turn our sights on another issue. When we talk about the US-China relations in the Indo-Pacific, it is hard not to bring the elephant into the room. That is India. America's outreach to India, both bilaterally and through the Quad, has seen New Delhi steadily drift into America's orbit, though not fully. It still retains its close ties to Russia. Also, India is in the Shanghai Cooperation Council, or organization, I should say, with both Russia and China. Can we expect India to play the role of Indo-Pacific bulwark against China? India's reluctance to move away from Russia must be giving the Biden administration some grief, or has it simply accepted that India will always be a, dare I say, strategically autonomous player within any American push against the Chinese? I mean, in other words, are there questions about Indian reliability as an American strategic partner?
I think as a first step, one should always assume that countries are going to do what they think is in their interests, right? And so to expect India to make enormous sacrifices because Washington is concerned about the balance of power in Asia is idealistic. India will do what is in its interests, and it obviously has reasons to be concerned about an Indo-Pacific region in which China was dominant. India does not want China to control the Indian Ocean. It doesn't want to be in a position where it has to accept Chinese dictates and defer to China in all sorts of ways. So it will act in various ways to do that, not because it likes us, not because it loves Australians, not because it's deeply fond of the Japanese, but because that's in India's interest. And for that reason, it's not surprising to me that India has not been, as condemning of the Russian invasion of Ukraine as some people in the West might have wished, might have hoped. It wasn't in India's interest, just as it's not been in the interest of a number of other countries, including some countries that are very close to the United States, like Israel as well. So I think if you're thinking about this, countries are not usually in this position of an either or, right? That they're either on our side or they're on our side. For many of them, there's a degree of ambiguity. If China continues to become more powerful, and especially if China continues to throw its weight around, including some of the border clashes with India. This is going to keep nudging India closer to the United States and closer to other countries in Asia, as we've already seen. India is also I think a very proud political culture as well. It has a tradition of non-alignment. It has its own political disagreements on how close you want to be to the West, given its own history as well. So there's always going to be, I think, a degree of ambivalence. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's like Turkey, but you can see some parallels there. That a potentially valuable ally in many circumstances, but also one that can be demanding and difficult and frustrating. I'd expect that to continue.
Yeah. Of course, one of the great fears we in the West have is that China and Russia will form a more solid entente between them as they increasingly cooperate in common military matters. We've seen Russian and Chinese forces conduct exercises together in and around the Sea of Japan and to a lesser degree in the South China Sea. But after Russia's performance in Ukraine, do you think China will move closer to Moscow or go it alone?
I think this is a really big question. I mean, I think, and I guess attach a bit of an error term around it. It's easy to be wrong about this. It's hard for me to think that that China is not viewing what's happening in Ukraine with some real misgivings. Yep. First of all, Russia just doesn't look like quite as valuable a partner as the Chinese might have hoped. Quite as capable either in terms of thinking strategically, sort of understanding what was going to happen and being able to perform on the battlefield as well. So I would be surprised if the Chinese weren't at least somewhat concerned about that. Second, it has complicated China's relationship with a number of other countries, especially in Europe, right? That relationship was already getting to be a little bit more delicate over some human rights issues and commercial issues as well. The Chinese refusal to outright condemn what Russia has done has put relations with much of Europe now even further in the deep freeze than they were before, and that's ultimately not good for China as well. And then finally, to the extent that this sort of wakes everybody up to the fact that international conflict still happens, that real wars do occur from time to time, that has to raise some questions about what countries in Asia are likely to do as well, so as not to suffer something similar. So again, for all of those reasons, it seems to me China has to view this with some misgivings. That said, having a friendly relationship with Russia is useful for China in terms of energy supplies. They're now getting them at bargain rates. It's useful for them not to have to worry about their Western borders, right? They don't want to go back to a situation where Russia and China are seriously at odds with one another. They certainly don't want Russia ever to realign with the West. They don't want Russia ever to do what Mao Zedong did when he realigned essentially with the United States in the 1970s. So all of those things are reasons to sort of keep Russia relatively close. And then finally, the final reason is, of course, this would require Xi Jinping to admit he was wrong. That to bet on China, or to bet on Russia to have built a much closer relationship, to have met with Putin as often as he did, I think it's 30 or so times, for him to distance himself from Russia at this point would be have to say, well, I was wrong about this. And admitting he was wrong is not something Xi Jinping seems to be very good at doing. Let me just add one other point. This does, I think, show you another limitation in Chinese diplomacy here. Because when the war in Ukraine started, you could have imagined China trying to take advantage of it in a different way. say, look, this is a horrible tragedy. This shows you that the Western powers cannot manage anything. They can't do diplomacy. They're always causing trouble. NATO expansion was a terrible idea. They're always causing conflicts, first in the Middle East, now in Europe. We don't defend at all what Russia is doing. But, we, the Chinese, understand conflict resolution, peaceful relations with others, and we would be prepared to offer our good offices to mediate this conflict because we can put pressure on everybody.
Yep.
We're in a position where we don't have a dog in this fight, and we're going to be like Theodore Roosevelt mediating the Russo-Japanese war. We're going to come in and show you what we can do here. Now, might not have worked, would have been difficult. They might not have had the leverage, but a public posture like that might not have won them a lot of friends in Europe, might not have won them a lot of friends in North America, but in other parts of the world, in parts of the global South, I think this would have been a very attractive move, just from a public relations point of view. But of course, they couldn't pursue that because it would have required, again, Xi Jinping basically to say, betting on Putin was maybe a bad bet I shouldn't have made, or I shouldn't have doubled down on it the way I did.
So do you think, having said that, do you think that really Xi's days might be numbered in terms of how he's sitting as the grand poobah on top of the CCP system? I mean, what you've said is pretty obvious to us, but maybe it's also pretty obvious to senior CCP members as well.
I am not nearly enough of an expert on the internal workings of the Chinese Communist Party to have a guess there. My impression is that his hold on power is actually pretty solid, and it would require a really sustained series of setbacks that had real consequences for China inside to dislodge him. I don't say those are impossible, but I don't think anything that's happened to date is sufficient. But again, I don't consider that my area of expertise, and you'd have to talk to someone like your former Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd, who does know an enormous amount about China and particularly the inner workings of the party itself.
I suppose the one thing that can be said is that if the world lurches into a food crisis sometime in 2023, this is going to have those sort of black swan effects on everyone's system, including the system in China. And how robust and resilient the CCP will turn out to be, well, I think that this will really test it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's not that's not the only problem that they're facing. They clearly have problems within their financial system, and the real estate sector is in deep trouble. The zero COVID policy has been an economic, I think, disaster may be too strong a word, but a serious economic problem for them. So, there's only so many crises that a political system can absorb before it really starts to have problems, and then you could see something like that happening there as well. I might add that that's not just true in China, though. That's true elsewhere. Obviously the consequences of the war in Ukraine are going to be significant for much of Europe, particularly over energy, but also just fueling inflation and other economic problems. It'll have significant repercussions in parts of the developing world that depend on grain from Russia and from Ukraine as well. And you could even argue that to some degree, this is the first major international event where Americans are actually going to feel the consequences. Ordinary Americans, if they weren't in the military, didn't have family members in the military, didn't really feel the effects of the wars we've fought over the last 25 years or so. We borrowed the money to pay for it. We didn't feel a real pinch. And I think the fighting in Ukraine, although we're not involved in it, does add to the economic woes that the country is feeling. And at some point, people may start asking, what are we doing here? Is this something that's worth doing? That may be what Russia is counting on, but of course the consequences for Russia are pretty severe as well. Anyway, everyone is going to feel the effects of this. And I should add that was something that I didn't fully anticipate when the war actually broke out.
Final two questions, if you don't mind. Stephen, I just finished reading this book called The End of the World is Just the Beginning by Peter Zeihan, which is a very well-written work, but it's a very grim read. I'm sure he won't mind me saying that. Anyway, in his book, Zeihan says that Russia and China are both on the cusp of collapse, and the US will come out of the mess that will be international relations over the next decade in relatively fine form. Do you think he's right on this?
I think it is a possibility in the following sense that unlike Russia and China, American demographics actually look pretty good. The United States is going to continue to grow in population, where both of those countries are going to shrink, and it's going to still be a relatively young population.
Yeah.
And that means more workers in their key productive years, fewer retirees that have to be supported by the rest of the economic systems. If we manage to not screw up our immigration policies too badly, we will also continue to be a magnet for talented, entrepreneurial, driven people who want to come here and start the next Google or whatever. And that's always been an asset for the United States. And as we're even seeing now, the United States remains the place where most people want to park their money when they're worried. And that's, again, another asset. So there's lots in our favor still. The principal things that worry me are threefold. One is, I think it doesn't matter if the United States does better than China if climate change ruins us all. That's a big problem that's not going to go away at the rate we're trying to address it. Second, obviously the dysfunction and division within the American political system is, I think, a source of real concern. We basically nearly lost our democracy back after the last election. It's now, I think, increasingly clear that, that Donald Trump tried to steal the election. He tried to mount an illegal coup, and he nearly got away with it. And one of the two political parties doesn't seem to be all that bothered by that. So that really worries me as well. And finally, there's also always the possibility that we'll screw up something badly internationally. That we will do another Iraq war, or we'll mismanage the situation vis-a-vis Taiwan or even Ukraine in ways that lead to unacceptable escalation and a really dangerous war. And we shouldn't forget that these are all countries that have nuclear weapons, and when countries are facing what they regard as existential threats, they sometimes think about using them. So those are the three things that keep worrying me. I certainly hope Peter's right. Speaking as an American, but I'll stay worried about enough other things anyway.
Okay, so finally, how do you view America's foreign policy elite? Are they able to handle the abundant and complex issues they face all over the world simultaneously?
Well, I wrote a whole book saying that the answer to that was no. A book called The Hell of Good Intentions, which said that the American foreign policy elite, although it has many virtues, hadn't been doing very well the last 25 years or so. And most worrisome of all, hadn't seemed able to reform itself, sort of shift and abandon a bunch of policies that simply weren't working. And I think that's unfortunately remains true. I mean, the Biden administration has been kind of the return of the old order, return of what some have called the blob, back to the old familiar orthodoxies, old sound bites about a rules-based order and spreading democracy and, uniting with our fellow democracies against autocracy, etc. And I like all of those ideas myself, but they have not been a very sound basis for conducting American foreign policy. I said a few weeks ago in my foreign policy column that what the Biden team is a bunch of very skilled mechanics who know how to run the foreign policy machinery. They can make the engine go, but they think they're driving a Lamborghini. And what they're really driving now is, a 1965 Ford that hasn't had enough maintenance in recent years. Yep. And what Biden needs is some people who can, build him a Tesla, and something that is actually appropriate for the century we're in, not the century we used to be in as well. And I don't see a lot of evidence that that's happening yet, but I can hope.
Well, fingers crossed. Stephen, Thank you for sharing your insights on the focus. It's been an absolute pleasure.
It's been great fun talking to you too.
Robert and Renee Belfer, Professor of International Affairs at Harvard University, Professor Stephen M. Walt. That's it for this episode. We hope that you enjoyed the show. My thanks to our guests, Stephen Walt, and producers Neil Smart and Malcolm Hughes. Thanks also to the Ozcast Network. You can find the focus on the Sage International website at sageinternational.com.au, the Ozcast Network, iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, and TuneIn. So if you like what you've heard, please like and review us on your favorite podcast platform. Until next time, I'm John Bruni, and you've been listening to Sage International's The Focus. Oh, God. Here we go.